Okay, Kat, I'm starting off this class. We're going to be talking about the um, diseases of the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system, and the respiratory system this week. Um, I may just record a couple of them today, but I'd like to go first to um, the other activities of the week. You have you have your discussion, and this week's discussion is going to be looking at um, the reasons that a pharmacy would make an investment to offer a free service to their customers. So when when you're thinking about that, um, read the material and think about the reasoning for doing that. So that's the discussion. I've started off on it, so we should be able to get to. You should be able to see what I've had to say about it. The assignment this week is, again, workbook chapters and answering questions. You're going to, answer the questions and then transfer the responses from the workbook to this assignment, which is a quiz again. So you'll have that to do. And finally, you have your assessment this week, and I'll be posting the video. Wanted to take a quick look at your at the grade book. As of last night, about mid-evening, there were a lot of things that you hadn't done. It looks like you may not have, no, you have not done the discussion from last week. You need to get that done. You did okay on the assignment and the assessment, but there still is a few things that you need to do. So you're doing fine in the class in terms of a grade, but not doing the discussion did cost you a little bit. So you have till the end of this week to get that done as well. That being the case, we will go back to looking at the readings for this week. You're in chapters 16, 17, and 19. 16 is the endocrine system, 17 is the cardiovascular system, and 19 is the respiratory system. So we'll talk about, we'll start off with chapter 16 as soon as it loads. Yeah, my computer is functioning very slowly for some strange reason. Let's talk about that. We'll go here and we'll zoom in. So the endocrine system is a set of cells, glands, and hormones, and the tissues that many of them target. It helps regulate metabolism and homeostasis of the body. The endocrine glands are scattered around the body and secrete their hormones into the bloodstream. The major glands are is characterized by this list: hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, pineal, parathyroid, thymus, adrenal, pancreas, ovaries, and testes. The pituitary is often called the master gland because much of that is much of the activity of the other endocrine glands is controlled by the pituitary, which in turn is controlled by the hypothalamus. So there is a redundancy and a feedback system to keep it from going haywire here. Now, hormones are chemicals produced by the body that regulate activities of organs or tissues. We can also ingest those or have them given to us. Insulin is secreted when blood glucose levels rise. If we don't have the ability to produce sufficient insulin, we can actually inject it and do that. When glucose levels fall below normals, glucagon, when the body needs sugar, glucagon helps release it. It's an antagonist to insulin. It stops insulin from taking care of the glucose level. So the system here, you can see this. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. And we can see the pineal gland is up in the cranium, right next to the brain. We have the thyroid and parathyroid glands are in the throat. The pituitary gland is also in the is at the bottom of the brain. We have the thymus in the upper chest, the adrenals, which lie on top of the kidney, the pancreas, which is an abdominal organ that does a lot of different functions. It helps digest food. It's the source of insulin. There are cells known as islet cells. They're in structures known as the islets of Langerhans that produce insulin, and the pancreas also is responsible for glucagon. And then the other parts of the endocrine system also include parts of the reproductive system, the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. Hormones actually seldom work on their own. There's usually some coordination between them to regulate body processes. We have secretions. They secrete into the digestive tract. They help with energy production. They control composition and volume of the fluid that is outside of our cells. Adaptation and immunity are a part of all of that. Growth and development, growth hormones and so forth, reproduction, all the hormones that go into reproduction and generating, encouraging lactation are there as well. The hypothalamus is in the brain, and it is the main center for controlling both the endocrine and the autonomic nervous systems. We can control blood pressure as well. The posterior pituitary causes secretion of what we call anti-diuretic hormone, vasopressin. This diuresis is when we remove water from our body through our kidneys. Vasopressin increases blood pressure when our blood volume is low. Also, we have oxytocin that's there. The hormones that come out of the hypothalamus signal the pituitary gland to release hormones like corticotropin, thyroid stimulating hormone, and also the gonadotropins, the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormones that control parts of our reproductive system. The pituitary gland, we go back up to this picture here, the pituitary, it's a very small, round gland um, that is at the base of the brain, and it is used for secreting hormones that regulate our other our other glands in the system. So this is a critical gland. It has two roles, two lobes, posterior and anterior, and the hypothalamus controls the activity, the chemical activity that goes on there. The anterior lobe secretes growth hormone. We know this as somatotropin. Um, Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin, is there. Thyroid stimulating, follicle stimulating, luteinizing, prolactin, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. All of these occur. So let's look at this little cartoon and raise it up here. So the pituitary sits adjacent to the hypothalamus. And these are the two lobes, the anterior and posterior. So all of these, this little graphic shows where these various things come from. Thyroid hormones, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormones, induces the thyroid to produce the two thyroid hormones known as T3 and T4. The 3 and the 4 tell you are the numbers of iodine atoms that are attached to the base molecule for the thyroid hormones. The corticotropin hormones, adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH, basically leads to causes the adrenals to kick out cortical hormones like cortisol and aldosterone. Cortisol is known as the stress hormone. It's one of the things that appears when we get under stress. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the testes to produce testosterone in the male. And in both follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones appear in the female to induce estrogen and progesterone production. Prolactin, obviously prolactin, it induces milk production and breast development. Melanocyte stimulating hormone controls pigment, and growth hormone controls the rate and extent of growth. We go over here to the posterior node or section, and we have let's see, we talked about this. We have this ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, causes the kidney to reabsorb water into the bloodstream. Oxytocin induces milk expulsion, and it also induces uterine contractions. So all of these come out of this little bitty organ. They're very potent molecules, so only very, very small amounts ever come out. But what they do is they stimulate important activities of other organs in the body. Growth hormone, somatotropin, stimulates cells to divide rapidly. Well, they first have to get bigger in order to divide. The adrenocorticotropic hormones stimulates growth in the cortex of the adrenal gland and the secretion of the corticosteroids. This usually occurs on a on a diurnal rhythm, meaning a sleep and day-based rhythm. The the peak of the adrenocorticotropic hormone secretion and activity occurs when you wake to get your body up and running for the day, but the increase begins after you've been asleep for a few hours. But this is another reason that we need sufficient sleep, because if it occurs after sleep, after the beginning of sleep for in a few hours, then it clearly has a function over time in generating the right amount of these hormones. TSH, a thyroid stimulating hormone, controls the release of thyroid. Thyroid controls metabolism. So the various thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, are important in controlling our metabolic activity. The thyroid gland is the only part of the body that uses iodine. TSH stimulates the uptake of iodine from our diet. So there are certain uses for this hormone, stimulating hormone. We also will give synthetic copies of the thyroid hormones for people whose thyroid isn't producing enough. FSH, follicle stimulating. We've already talked about that, the development of the eggs in the ovaries and the sperm in the testes, and it also stimulates the ovaries to secrete estrogen in the female. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the sex hormones in secretion in both. Testosterone is in the males, and progesterone in the females. Prolactin is something that is then is secreted by the gland, the pituitary, after pregnancy and delivery of an infant, so that the milk production can start and nourish the newborn here. The posterior releases the antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Vasopressin, this refers to the fact that this drug increases blood pressure. It's a natural increase, a natural stimulant of increased blood pressure, and it works by increasing blood volume, by having the kidneys reabsorb water and put it back into the circulation. Also, oxytocin is released here, and that produces the contractions in a uterus when giving birth. And also has an effect on causing milk to flow. If we look now and go to the pineal gland, this is a small gland found in the thalamus of the brain. Let's go back up quickly to our larger picture here. This little bitty gland right here at in the brain, in the center area at the back of the brain, is the pineal. It's a little bitty thing. So let's quickly scroll down. That's growth hormone. It's located in the thalamic area of the brain, and it secretes melatonin, which regulates the body's circadian rhythm. This is an important part. The circadian rhythm is a time when we sleep versus being awake. And it's important that that be consistent for good health. The thyroid is in the anterior of the neck, the back of the neck, or the front of the neck. It is the largest of the endocrine glands, and he has these right and left lobes secreting thyroxine, which is T4. This is the one that has 4 iodine atoms, and triiodothyronine, which is what we call T3, triiodo, meaning 3 iodine atoms. And governs the rate at which cellular oxygen is processed and used to produce energy and heat. Thyroid is essential. Decreased levels of T3 and T4 stimulate the release of TRH from the thalamus or the hypothalamus, and which then stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete TSH. So this is a complex system. And calcitonin is critical to calcium metabolism. Calcium is an important ion, not just in the bones, but also inside cellular processes. The parathyroids are 4 tiny glands that are on the surface of the thyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone is stimulated by low plasma levels of calcium. This hormone targets bones, intestines, kidneys, etc., to increase plasma calcium levels, and actually stimulates bone breakdown to release calcium back into the bloodstream when we do not have sufficient plasma levels of calcium. The thymus is located in the chest cavity, superior and anterior to the heart, so it's above and in front. It is critical in the developing immune system. In the immune system, we have the blood cells, the B cells, that produce antibodies, but the T cells, T lymphocytes, stimulate the B cells to actually begin that production. So it's a very complex system, but it starts with these T lymphocytes. There are a number of those. So the thymus will secrete thymosin after a child is born, which starts developing the immune system itself. The thymus, is its greatest size during puberty and then begins to shrink throughout life. Adrenals are on the top of each kidney. They have an outer cortex and an inner adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex synthesizes the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids. Aldosterone is the one that we most think of, and the androgens, which are the steroid sex hormones. The glucocorticoids, cortisol is the most common, but there are others as well. So here we have a picture of where of the sort of lower abdominal area where we have the adrenals, kidneys, the pancreas, the ovaries, and the testes. So these are all down in the abdominal cavity. Everything else has been in the upper body. The adrenals are pretty important. We have the capsule is the surface set of cells protecting it from the rest of the abdominal cavity. Then we have the cortex, this lining of cells that goes around it. And then the medulla is this center mass here. So you can see there are a number of different cell types. The cortex is here. We've got the capsule, which is basically a layer of protecting, and these two um, barrier layers between capsule and the cortex, and between the cortex and the medulla. They're thin. Cortisol regulates carbohydrates. It also is something um, that speeds up certain autonomic processes, and is responsible for stress reactions. Aldosterone is a regulator of sodium and potassium. These are critical elements that need to be well balanced in the body. There's a specific function. The sodium is the main extracellular ion. Not solely extracellular, but it is mainly extracellular, and potassium is the main intracellular. Androgens regulate the secondary sex characteristics like hair and that sort of thing, facial and other hair. The medulla secretes epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, norepinephrine or noradrenaline. Both of these are vital in, again, in in emergency situations. This is part of the fight or flight kind of reaction. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, and respirations, which then allows the body to function better under stress. Chronic stress, however, is very bad for the body. So what we want to do is have these when they're necessary, but not otherwise. The pancreas is a part of the digestive system, and it's below the inner curvature of the stomach. It has both endocrine and what we call exocrine functions. It produces digestive enzymes. These are part of the exocrine functions. The alpha and beta cells are on these islets of Langerhans that I mentioned a while back. The alpha cells produce the glucagon to raise blood glucose levels. The beta cells release insulin to lower blood glucose levels. When the glucose levels decline, the glucagon facilitates breakdown of glycogen in the liver to produce glucose. Glycogen is a storage molecule that's made up of many molecules of glucose. It's a polymer. Ovaries are the female gonads. Gonads are the sex organs. In the lower abdominal or abdominopelvic cavity, producing female sex hormones there. Testes are the male sex organs. Two oval glands. They produce the hormone testosterone, and the gametes, the sperm. The ovaries produce the eggs, which are the female gamete. Disorders, there's lots of them. We've got a number of forms of diabetes. We've got diseases of low pituitary activity and high pituitary activity. We've got diseases that are related to thyroid malfunction. These include goiter, Hashimoto's, both hyper and hypo, high and low thyroid hormones, and myxedema. Cushing's syndrome, Addison's disease, and there are some other malfunctions we'll get to, neuroblastoma and pheocytochroma. Diabetes insipidus is due as a disturbance of water metabolism due to a deficiency of vasopressin. Vasopressin keeps keeps the kidneys reabsorbing the right amount of water from urine to maintain homeostasis. What it amounts to is that when in this disease, when our vasopressin levels are low, we're urinating more, and it's usually not colored. So we do have ways of using either vasopressin itself as a drug or a synthetic, semi-synthetic form, desmopressin, and using various diuretics to force the kidneys to use um, to control their rate of urination. Hypopituitarism is basically any of the pituitary hormones, and we just saw a whole list of them, especially from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Can be growth retardation in children, but it could be caused by tumors. It can be caused by other factors, and it depends on the type of deficiency. Remember, there are half a dozen different hormones being produced by that particular part of the pituitary. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Hypopituitarism is something that is when the pituitary is not producing or hypo is not producing. Dwarfism is something that can occur in children. You can it can be caused by trauma, infection, or tumor. Those are things that we can treat. If we have a if the manifestation we're seeing is dwarfism, we can use growth hormone, somatotropin, to replace the loss of growth hormone in an underproducing pituitary, and so we can use that. Hyperpituitarism is excessive production, especially growth hormone. We can excessive growth hormone can either produce gigantism or acromegaly. Gigantism is an abnormal pattern of growth resulting from a sort of proportional overgrowth of all body tissue. So people are tall and big and unusual. It's often caused by a form of cancer known as an adenoma. Treatment is usually focused on reducing the amounts of growth hormone that are secreted by surgery, radiation, or other hormone treatments. Acromegaly occurs when when a lot of usually appears after age 30 or 40. It's an overgrowth of only the bones of the face, hands, feet, and soft tissue. Treatments again are designed to reduce the growth hormone secretion, and surgery. And if it's tumor, it can be surgery or radiation. We'll go now to the thyroid. Thyroid issues include goiter, which is an enlargement of the thyroid gland. This is usually seen as sort of a swollen throat. And a lot of times it can be from a shortage of iodine in the diet, which is why we started using iodized salt. We can take we can take potassium, or we can take iodine supplements, um, and use thyroid hormones as replacement therapy, and avoiding certain foods or drugs that will suppress the thyroid. Hashimoto's is an inflammation of the thyroid, and it is it's more commonly seen in women between 45 and 65, and treatment requires replacement of the thyroid hormones over the patient's entire lifetime. Um, and this will also, by doing that, prevent additional growth. Overproduction of thyroid hormone, it causes increased metabolism. The diseases that we see include Graves' disease, and it is a primary hyperthyroid disease, and it's also an autoimmune disease. It causes what we call exophthalmos, which is bug eyes, basically eyeball protrusion. Treatments include suppressing thyroid function, using other drugs. We can use radioactive iodine, since iodine is absorbed preferentially into the thyroid, to try and destroy some of the thyroid tissue. And less commonly these days, but it used to be much more common, surgical removal of the thyroid. Hypothyroidism is a disease that is not gender related. It's not age related, but it appears to be familial. Cretinism is a form of congenital hypothyroidism that we see in early childhood or even infancy. We have mental and physical retardation, and then hormone replacement is the only real therapy. Myxedema is a severe and prolonged lack of thyroid in older children and adults. The symptoms can be skin changes, fatigue, etc., all these things. And remember that hypothyroidism means that our metabolism is lowered. We're not generating enough consumption of oxygen and therefore energy, so in our cells. So we have a series of potential symptoms. The earlier you catch it, the better, like anything else. And the only treatment is lifelong use of thyroxine. Cushing's is a disease of the adrenal cortex, and it involves hypersecretion of cortisol, and the fatigue, muscle weakness, fat deposits in the abdomen and shoulders, edema, and so forth. Treatment is based on the cause. Could include surgical removal of the adrenal, radiation, and drugs that will actually suppress the secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone. Cushing's syndrome, characteristic signs: this person does look quite unhealthy. Her hair does not look good. Her skin, she's got a lot of edema here, extra fleshy growth. And with treatment, we have a much more healthy looking person here on the right. Addison's is related to a failure of adrenocortical function, sometimes gradual or often gradual. Sometimes it can be a lot faster, and it can be partial or total failure. Symptoms: fatigue, weakness, lack of appetite, weight loss, etc. Here. and then some cardiovascular and GI issues. Treatment, we can usually give um, um, the hormones that would have been secreted, and use the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids, and other methods of helping the patient. Neuroblastoma is a cancer that usually comes from from the adrenal medulla, um, and it is almost always seen um, in children under age 5. Um, the um, the symptoms are a series of compounds called catecholamines that can be seen in the urine. The urine also has a distinct smell. It's the abdominal pain and fullness. Um, Treatments can include surgery, chemo, radiation, and stem cells. Pheochromocytoma is a tumor of the medulla, which increases the release of epinephrine and norepi. Symptoms include this abdominal and chest pain, and other things, tachycardia, severe headaches, sweating, etc. Surgical removal, if possible, is the only is the only real is the first line of treatment. You can try giving medications to manage tumor growth, but that's a whole different issue. One of the most important um, there are two endocrine disorders that are very common. One is diseases of the thyroid. Both hypo and hyperthyroidism are some of the most common conditions in the United States. In fact, the synthetic form of thyroxine, known as levothyroxine, is the most prescribed medication in America. So that is probably the leading adrenal issue. It's not spoken of in ways because the control using levothyroxine is very successful with most people. People will take levothyroxine for basically the remainder of their lives. The other major metabolic disease is diabetes mellitus, a chronic disorder of carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. It's caused by an inadequate production of insulin by the pancreas, and at the same time, ineffective utilization of insulin that is produced by the cells. Type 1, which usually has early onset. We used to call it juvenile, but type 1 can appear in adults as well. But it has a very quick onset, and is basically one of the more risky and uncontrollable diabetes. Type 2, the more common form, is something that develops slowly with age. So type 1 usually occurs before 30. We used to think of it as I said, as juvenile, but people older than 30 can suddenly develop type 1 diabetes. This is a disease in which the pancreas secretes little or even no insulin at all. Type 2 is more common in adults, more commonly developed in adults over age 30. Either of these diseases is a lifetime disease once it starts. So it's when it develops that helps us understand. Some pancreatic function remains, some insulin is produced, and other functions work. So a lot of dietary and drug management strategies are possible with type 2 diabetes. Um, the symptoms of diabetes mellitus, both of these things, um, are hyperglycemia, um, cellular metabolism of fats and proteins as opposed to sugars, accumulation of something called ketone bodies in the blood. We call this ketosis. Um, and it causes a fruity odor to the breath and itching. Um, acidosis, meaning our blood gets acidic. Polyphagia, polyuria, polydipsia, fatigue, weight loss, etc. All of these are things that diabetics get to deal with. Treatments, usually we aim at normalizing blood glucose. We can do this with diet control, insulin, oral drugs to reduce uh, um, sugar levels. We call those hypoglycemics. A class of drugs known as sulfonylureas, and another class, the meglitinides, to regulate blood and urine, and using regular blood and urine testing, exercise, good hygiene, um, uh, and um, and good diet. Um, the complicating factors of diabetes are when you start messing around with sugar metabolism, you mess up the ability of the body to heal. This is why so many diabetic patients who are bedridden will develop bed sores, decubitus ulcers, because their body can't, has a reduced ability to heal the little traumas and little insults that these pressure sores cause. And as a result, infections are not uncommon. Many diabetics will start losing toes and then limbs. And so this is a major issue. The fact that they don't think right, because of course the brain functions on sugar, on using expending those calories to maintain that function. So their thought processes go off, their ability to heal falls off the ladder, and they just have a rough time of doing what they a rough time of living. There is a gestational form of diabetes, sometimes called type 3, occurs during pregnancy, and is influenced by placental hormones that occasionally can block insulin. Um, the We get a rise in blood glucose. This usually starts occurring between weeks 24 and 28. Um, so treatment here is to limit intake of the simple sugars. Simple sugars are things like, you know, sugar in your soft drinks and that sort of thing. Those are simple sugars. More complex sugars are carbohydrates, which are carbohydrates are just um, um, polymers, meaning many copies strung together of various forms of sugar molecules, and there are many of those. A little bit of moderate exercise, some of the hypoglycemic drugs that we can take, like metformin and others. Sometimes it'll even require insulin, but we have to monitor those carefully. Okay. So there are the medications that are there. You can get a good list of medications in your book, but drugs for thyroid conditions, generally the go-to drug is levothyroxine. And in diabetes for type 1 and advanced and very severe type 2 insulin can be given via injection, subcutaneous injection. And if possible, we would prefer to use oral hypoglycemics for the simple reason that anytime you poke somebody's skin with a needle, there's a risk of infection. So it's always preferable to have drugs. So that is the, let's put that back together. That is the that chapter. And we will do, I'm going to take a break, so I'm going to turn off the recording for now, and I'll be back in a, for you, I'll be back in a few seconds, but for me, I'm going to be back in about 10-ish minutes. So then we'll pick up on chapter 17, the cardiovascular system. Okay, so now we're back, and we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system. And I think that's probably all we'll talk about tonight. Okay, we know the cardiovascular system consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and is vital to life for us, transports nutrients and oxygen to cells, and transports waste products and carbon dioxide away from cells, and circulates through the cleansing organisms, or organs rather, like the liver and the kidneys, in order to remove toxins and other stuff. The heart also gets the blood oxygenated by pumping blood into the pulmonary system, so that the gas exchange can occur. And that blood then comes back to the heart, which then pumps it to the rest of the body. So it's really the motor that runs us. The pulmonary circulation is the first thing that happens. The first thing that happens when blood leaves the heart, it goes to the lung through the pulmonary artery that goes into the lung, and then the gases are exchanged, and that oxygenated blood is then pumped, comes back into the heart to be then to be distributed to the rest of the body. In the systemic circulation, as opposed to pulmonary circulation, oxygenated blood goes to the body tissues, and the circulation carries nutrients and hormones to various body tissues, and then when it's returning from those, it will carry waste materials, which are then processed as well by the detoxification organs, usually the kidney and the liver. The heart is about the size of your fist, lying behind your sternum. You know that, and it is it is basically a pump. It's a big muscle. That's all it is. It's a muscle, and it sort of rests on the diaphragm. We have an interior layer of cells called the endocardium. The myocardium is the muscular middle layer, and the epicardium is the outer sac, and also is the outer heart layer. This encloses the pericardium, which is a sac that actually encloses and protects the heart. The heart is divided into 4 chambers. The upper chambers are called atria. Atria just means a room, a space. And then the lower chambers are the ventricles. The right atrium gets the blood from the body, and the left atrium receives blood back from the pulmonary circulation. So the right atrium gets blood the right atrium receives blood from the body, from what we call the vena cava, the big veins that take blood back to the heart. And then that blood is moved from the right atrium to the right ventricle, which then pumps, which is the pumping chamber, and then that that chamber pumps the blood to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. It comes back into the left atrium, goes to the left ventricle, and is then pumped into the body through the aorta. There are valves at the entrance and exit points of all the ventricles, and they keep, their function is to keep the blood flowing in a forward direction. So the valve should seal up when blood is being pumped out. The entrance valve from the atrium seals up when the blood is pumped out of the ventricle, and that keeps blood flowing properly. These valves, the right atrium is separated from the right ventricle by what's known as the tricuspid valve. This is basically three little, we call them leaflets, but they're membranes that will open in one direction and close from the other. So it's a one-way door. The pulmonary valve is called a semilunar valve because it's shaped like a half moon. It is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. And again, its function is to keep blood from coming back in to the right ventricle when it relaxes. The left atrium is separated from the left ventricle by the mitral valve, which is known as a bicuspid valve. It has two flaps, and again, it's a one-way door. The aortic valve is also similar, is also a semilunar valve or half moon shaped, and it's between the left ventricle and the aorta. Again, the purpose is to prevent backflow of blood. The heart chambers alternate between relaxing to fill with blood and contracting to push blood forward. When a chamber is relaxed, this is called diastole. And when it's contracting, this is called systole. So that's why we have a systolic. We have the two components of blood pressure are the systolic when a chamber is contracting, and diastolic when the chamber is relaxed. There are several mechanisms of control of the heart. The rate is controlled first off by the SA node, the sinoatrial node on the wall of the right atrium. It is the pacemaker for the heart. It produces electrical impulses that spread to cardiac muscle cells, causing contraction of both atria nearly simultaneously. Electrical impulses reach the ventricles, and then these impulses are channeled through the atrioventricular or AV node along a series of specialized cells called the atrioventricular bundle. We should have a picture of some of this later. Two branches from the AV bundle are called bundle branches. They divide into smaller branches and terminate on what are called the Purkinje fibers. These fibers cause the ventricles to contract. So here we have the SA node, which is the pacemaker, here in the right atrium on the wall. Okay. We have the AV, the atrial ventricular node, just inside the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And we have signals going down the bundle branches from the AV node. The first thing we have is the AV bundle, and then it branches, one to each side of the heart, as we can see here. Signals, these arrows show the direction that the signals are traveling. And then the AV, the bundle branches then differentiate into, we just see a couple here, but they're all around the heart, the Purkinje's fibers. We have a septum coming in between the two sides of the heart. And we have, this is the interventricular septum. We have another layer, a series of barriers that include the valves. And so we have the left atrium. The sinoatrial mode controls contraction of these, and then the AV node controls the contraction of the ventricles. So the blood vessels so the heart heads, the blood heads out of the heart and into the blood system through the aorta. This big tube here is the aorta with lots of different branches. The aorta loops over the heart, and then a series of arteries come off this curve that move up toward the head. The aorta then goes down through the rest of the thoracic cavity and into the abdominal cavity, and branches out from there. So we have arteries, capillaries, and veins. We also have a series of smaller sizes. Ultimately, as the blood pumps blood, as the heart pumps blood through the out into the body, it goes through a series of decreasing sized vessels. Ultimately, the smallest are the arterioles, and then the link between arteriole and the smallest form of vein, the venules, is the capillaries. Capillaries basically will allow basically the blood to flow with the oxygen-containing cells, the erythrocytes, basically in a single file. Arteries have thicker walls than other vessels, and it's a smooth a muscle that contracts or relaxes, and this is what keeps blood moving. The veins will also help that process, but the arteries keep the blood moving and under a relatively constant pressure throughout the body. Capillaries are where nutrients and electrolytes, gases, and so forth are exchanged in the cells. Networks of capillaries are called capillary beds. They have extremely thin and very permeable walls. Blood flow through the capillaries is actually slow because it takes time for all of that exchange of nutrients and electrolytes and oxygen and so forth to occur. The capillary bed then converges into venules, which move toward veins, which return blood to the heart. The walls of veins are thinner than those of arteries. Veins have valves as well that allow blood to move in only one direction and have a much lower blood pressure than arteries. So let's take a look at what we are looking at. We got a couple of cartoons here. Um, and this gives you an idea of what is going on here. We have the artery. The interior lining is called the lumen. The blood flows down this tube. We've got a couple of other layers. Smooth muscle. The lumen is an endothelial cell layer. Then we have smooth muscle, and then we have a sheath that surrounds them of other tissue that's not muscular. You can see that the tissues surrounding these arteries and veins around the arteries contain blood vessels because they need muscle. They need oxygen to work. So they have arteries, the red things, and veins, the blue. So then branches come off the arteries and get smaller and smaller and eventually give rise to the capillaries. And the structure of veins is similar, except that it's a much smaller muscle mass that's moving things, and we have these valves. This is an example of a valve. Again, blood will flow through here, but it can't flow back because the backflow would cause these two flaps to come together and seal it off. So blood itself consists of a number of different kinds of cells, mainly red and white blood cells and platelets, which are in a liquid medium called plasma. The plasma includes water, hormones, proteins, nutrients, cellular wastes, gases, all the other components that are there. The process of production of red blood cells in the long bones of the body is called erythropoiesis. The red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which combines with oxygen to carry to the cell. Red blood cells are enucleate. They do not have a nucleus. Red blood cells have about a 120-day lifetime in the circulation. White blood cells come in a variety of different types. Granulocytes, which are called that because if you look at them under a microscope, you can see what look like granules inside the cell, and agranulocytes, which do not have those same things. And the granulocytes cells neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And the agranulocytes, we have monocytes and lymphocytes. So the lymphocytes, if you remember back from the endocrine lecture a little while ago, the lymphocytes are the T and B cells, among many other functions. There are a number of lymphocytes, but we have B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes that are important in the immune system. Neutrophils and monocytes eat stuff. Phagocytes means to eat cells. So they will absorb, they will engulf foreign particles and start tearing them apart. Neutrophils are the most numerous of the white cells. Eosinophils are used for several things: to control inflammation and to kill parasites, as well as to a certain level of control over the production of the mediators of allergic reactions. Basophils release heparin. Heparin is a molecule inhibits blood clotting. So this is a natural way of keeping blood from clotting while it's circulating around the body. Histamine is also there, which stimulates blood flow to injured tissue. Lymphocytes, um, among other things, produce antibodies. They also produce cellular mediators if they're T lymphocytes that influence the activity of B lymphocytes. And platelets are used basically as plugs in breaks in blood vessels. We get a lot of those. You know, bruising is one, but there are many breaks that basically don't produce sort of any sort of symptom, any sort of sign that you've gotten a broken blood vessel because the platelets get in there and close it off. So here we have a cartoon with major components of blood. We've got erythrocytes, thrombocytes, these platelets, monocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, basophils. So the leukocytes are there. If we spin it down, which you've all done in your hematology class and probably phlebotomy, if we take whole blood, if we spin it down, there will be a red layer. That's where we have packed these erythrocytes. And then a plasma layer. And sometimes in between, we can see, usually in between, we can see what we call a buffy coat layer, which is a sort of beige layer in between, a beige to off, sort of an off-white layer that forms between the plasma and the erythrocytes. Blood pressure is a topic that is often you spend a lot of time with, but blood pressure is the force asserted by blood against the vessel walls. This is why the blood vessels are surrounded by muscle. The muscle actually protects the interior, the lumen, and the epithelial cells that form the lumen from being destroyed. So we have systolic pressure is the pressure during ventricular systole, in other words, when it contracts. And diastolic pressure is the pressure that can be measured in the arteries during ventricular diastole, which is when the ventricles relax. The pulse is something that is felt. And this pulse is an indicator that blood is surging through an artery, which is caused by contraction of the arterial wall muscles as well as the heart. So the pulse rate should be equal to the rate at which the heart itself is pumping, because it all works together as a system. So cardiovascular disorders are still the leading cause of death in the US. There are a lot of different cardiovascular disorders, and here's a list. We're going to go down that list on the next few slides. I'll give you a moment to study that. Is it an exhaustive list? No, but these are the major issues. Risks so as I said before, cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the US. We have been able to learn a lot about cardiovascular disease and have been able to help some individuals who have risk factors for cardiovascular disease change lifestyle and behavior to reduce the likelihood of that. So now we'll go through a list. Arteriosclerosis. We're going to have two related terms. Arteriosclerosis is a degenerative change in the small arteries. And we all, we've got lots of arteries, but the smaller ones. We're not talking about the major ones. They lose elasticity and they become thick and hard. This is also called hardening of the arteries. The lumen gradually narrows and may actually becomes so narrow that it blocks the flow of blood, causing ischemia, which is a word that simply means blood flow not getting to tissue, and then and not getting oxygen to the tissue, and then the tissue downstream from that blockage can die. Atherosclerosis is different in that atherosclerosis are are plaques, meaning accumulations of material um, in the arteries. We also call these things atheromas, and they can be all sorts of things: lipids, cells, cell debris. The cells are often thrombocytes, and they form inside the walls of the larger arteries. Things like the femoral artery, and even the aorta. Thrombi are often attached. Thrombi are are parts of these things that will break off and block the flow of blood through smaller vessels. Um, these things are formed in large arteries like the aorta and the coronary arteries. So let's take a look at this cartoon. So we have a normal artery. The lumen is open and it's pretty smooth. So here we have a small atheroma, which is just a little layer of material on one section of the lumen. But it starts to enlarge, and then it gets larger and larger and spreads around the entire lumen. And then this can cause myocardial ischemia, especially if this is a coronary artery, which is what it says here. Coronary ischemia means the heart isn't getting enough oxygen. So that can lead to angina. Angina is a painful condition in which the heart muscle responds to the lack of oxygen by sending a very severe pain signal to the brain, saying there's a problem here. If we take this to this narrowing here of the lumen to an extreme and effectively block it, and sometimes this is going to be including layers of calcium being deposited here in this atheroma. It can block it and stop blood flow to a section of heart muscle. Here's an example. If we have the left descending artery here, we have a blockage. Then the muscle downstream from that begins to die. And if it is deprived of oxygen long enough, it will indeed die. This is a myocardial infarction. Infarction simply means that it's going to stop. So you have the muscle itself stops functioning, and the patient is either dies or has some sort of emergency procedure done to try and salvage heart function. Angina is transient. Angina pectoris merely is pain in the pectoral area, the upper chest area on the left side near the heart. Okay, so we can see here that this is caused by insufficient oxygen, and we can and it comes from this arterial narrowing. You can see speeding up of the heart, tachycardia. A number of other things can help lead to this. Hyperthyroidism and hypotension can cause these oxygen imbalances as well. So there are a lot of causes, potential causes for angina. Stable angina, what we call classic angina, is predictable, and it usually arises from exertion, stress, or a heavy meal. The pain is relieved by, by rest and by use of nitroglycerin or similar drugs, but mostly nitroglycerin. It's cheap, it's easy, it works. Nitroglycerin works by causing the artery to relax. And when it relaxes, it allows more blood flow. And this is the way nitroglycerin and erythritol tetranitrate and um, uh, several other drugs that can be used to treat uh, the symptoms of angina. These drugs are taken under the tongue. From the standpoint of the pharmacy, we never um, give patients nitroglycerin tablets in a standard medicine bottle. We simply give them the provided 100 tablet screw top medicine bottle because the screw top is a lot easier for most people to open, especially your heart hurts, you're really scared. You don't want to be prying open one of those child-proof containers. So we have not only, we give them this bottle and tell them carry it all the time, but a lot of people will carry on a keychain. They'll carry a little vial with a screw top with a bunch of tablets in it so that they don't have to carry the whole bottle all the time. Another form of angina is what we call unstable. This is angina that appears when you're being a couch potato, basically. You're lying, you might be lying watching TV, and all of a sudden you feel either pain or pressure on your chest. This is unstable angina, and that is something that if someone experiences, they need to get to a hospital or get the EMTs to their location immediately. Another form is angina that is a periodic pain, but not um, but not a but not as severe as the unstable and severe or as increasing as the unstable. We sometimes call this vasospastic angina. It is a periodic pain that occurs when lying down, but comes and goes. This is caused when sometimes the coronary artery will spasm for one reason or another and decrease the myocardial blood flow. Um, and there's something called silent angina. It's an impairment of the reserve of the endogenous vasodilators that allow the compounds the body produces to allow the arteries to relax. Um, the arteries themselves are not clogged or do not have atheromas. Myocardial infarction is called a heart attack. That's our common word. Heart attack is a lot faster and easier than myocardial infarction. And it occurs as a result of blood flow reduction through generally just one of the coronary arteries, but it could be more. This causes tissue loss of oxygen and what we call ischemia, lack of oxygen in the myocardium, the muscles of the heart, or a section of that, and the tissue dies there, tissue necrosis. MIs are the leading cause of death in the US. Risk factors. Family history is a major risk factor. Males will predominate. Postmenopausal women are then can have heart attacks at roughly the same rate of the same age of men. Hypertension is a major issue. Obesity, a sedentary lifestyle, age, smoking, stress, drug use, um, and elevated lipids in the drug, both triglycerides and cholesterol and lipoproteins. in the drug. So here's another example of what happens. We have this outline of the exterior of the heart. We've got the pulmonary artery, the aorta, the pulmonary veins coming back, the to the left and the right, the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and the left atrium is up here. But if we have an occlusion here in this vessel, then what happens is that everything past that vessel, you can see the rest of these go out into the heart muscle to provide nutrition. And then it blocks this off. We get an area of ischemia, which is an area that's not getting oxygen, an area of proximal injury here. This is adjacent to an area in which the tissue is dying. So, and it will spread. So this is how this happens. This muscle is no longer capable of contracting, and therefore you have a heart attack. Hypertension is an increase in blood pressure. What we call essential or primary hypertension is the most common form. There is a secondary hypertension, which is related to renal disease or certain other causes. Hypertension is a major cause of cardiac disease, renal failure, and stroke. Why renal failure and stroke? Well, high pressure in the smaller arteries can cause them to rupture. Stroke has two different forms. Stroke, and this is a CNS manifestation. Stroke is a heart attack in the brain, basically. A clot or some other material blocks a vessel of blood vessel in the brain, starving a section of the brain of oxygen. The tissue can die, and it can and therefore you lose the ability to use that portion of the brain. Another form of this can also happen in the kidney. You can have a blockage in the kidney vein as well, and then causing the kidneys to have the same kind of reaction, ischemia and potentially necrosis. Another thing that can happen with hypertension is that you can actually put enough pressure on a small artery to have it rupture. This and when it's a rupture in the brain, it's called a hemorrhagic stroke. Then blood is moving into the tissue of the brain, and blood in the tissue of the brain is bad. So you can these are the really bad strokes that sometimes will outright kill someone or turn them into a vegetative state. Stroke and hypertension is something that the statistics are hard to measure because a lot of people have it. It's called a silent disease. It's a silent killer because you don't feel anything. You can only try and measure it. So about 15 to 20% of US adults have hypertension. The elderly, African Americans, low income men during young and early middle adulthood, and women in a late adulthood are the highest risk people of hypertension. Arrhythmias. Remember we talked about the SA node, the sinoate. The AV node, the atrioventricular mode. Node is the pacemaker of the heart. And the heart usually has a very steady rhythm, and we can measure that rhythm. You learned that when you took ECG. So we can measure that rhythm, and we can measure how well the various parts of the heart are functioning. Cardiac arrhythmias are also called dysrhythmias. What this means is that it's not normal. Dysrhythmia is like dysfunction, not normal function. So you can see that there's those are the deviations from the normal rate or rhythm. It can be these things can be a different rhythm as well, even though the heart rate may stay the same. They can be from a number of different sources. Arrhythmias can occur from this list of different causes. It reduces the efficiency of the pumping. A very rapid heart rate um, prevents adequate filling during diastole and therefore reduces cardiac output, which also then reduces pressure. Very slow reduces the output to the tissues, including the brain and the heart itself. So cardiac arrhythmias, we can have um, um, tachycardia, very rapid heart rate, and bradycardia, slow heart rate. Another major cardiovascular congestive heart failure. This occurs when the heart can't pump enough blood to meet the body's needs. Gradual congestion and of the cardiopulmonary and the general vascular system develops, and we see shortness of breath, tachycardia usually, neck vein distension, and edema is something that we see. The right-sided failure leads to congestion of the liver and spleen, and left-sided failure leads to congestion and edema of the lungs. Treatment needs to focus on identifying the underlying causes, and we can use drugs to slow the heart rate. We can use drugs to increase the force of contraction, and we can reduce the heart's workload. Hyperlipidemia. These days we try to avoid that term. We call it dyslipidemia, meaning not normal levels of lipid. It could be low or it could be high. Low lipids are not good either. We need a certain amount of lipids in our bodies and diets. Unfortunately, we get probably, for the most part, way more than we need. Lipids are fats, are usually transported with proteins. These are the lipid proteins. And they play a role in our diseases. Lipids are synthesized in the liver, including cholesterol. Dietary and drug therapy of elevated plasma cholesterol can reduce the risk of the atherosclerotic plaque, the atheroma that we talked about earlier, and CV disease. The Also, we can use dietary control to try and reduce the ingestion of these things, because we produce almost everything we need. High serum cholesterol and the class of what we call low density lipoproteins. There are many different types of lipoproteins, but we focus mainly on the high density and low density lipoproteins. Um, but if we're looking at elevated cholesterol levels and elevated levels of low density lipoproteins, we have an increased risk of heart disease. Total cholesterol, triglycerides, which is another form of storing of lipids, low density and high density lipoproteins are all subgroups that have various risk factors. Other kinds of disorders include a variety of different um, um, anemias, meaning low amount of iron carrying ability to carry oxygen because we have low levels of iron. We have some diseases, other diseases here on this list. We will go down through some of these right now. Aplastic anemia results from damage to the stem cells in the bone marrow, which produce our blood cells. So it causes what we call pancytopenia. Um, Pancytopenia just means that a lot of cells are not there. Penia means low levels. Generally produces fatal bleeding and leads to infections. Lots of things can cause them. Some antibiotics, some anticonvulsants, hepatitis, etc. Folic acid deficiency anemia is something that is a slowly progressive condition. Poor diet, impaired absorption, overcooking of food, and long drug therapy and rapid growth in younger people. Um, we can use folic acid supplements to treat that. Iron deficiency anemia is a problem with oxygen transport in which we're just not producing enough hemoglobin. It is most common in premenopausal women, premature babies, children, and female adolescents, although it can occur in men. Low dietary iron, malabsorption, a lot of different things can cause this. A lot of it has to do with GI bleeding, loss of blood. Iron is something we need in very limited amounts in the body. Too much iron is actually toxic. Pernicious anemia is something that is an issue that is caused by vitamin B12 deficiency. So in the system, we can't absorb it because of different things going on in the stomach that really keeps it from being absorbed in the stomach. The red blood cells are large and misshapen, and then we have various damage that can occur. Polycythemia vera on the other hand, is a large increase in the mass of red blood cells and increased hemoglobin levels, also with increased white blood cells and platelets, most common between the ages of 40 and 60, and of certain ethnic groups. The only real treatment for polycythemia vera is regular bleeding to reduce and then replacement with either plasma or IV fluids like dextrose or normal saline, probably NSD5W mix. So then we have idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, which is we can see from thrombocytopenic, that means we have low numbers of platelets. So we have a deficiency of these things because the immune system has destroyed them. It could be acute or it could be chronic. It might be caused by viral infections. It might be caused by other factors as well. Regular old thrombocytopenia is a deficiency of platelets. And platelets are being a part of the bleeding control system. It can lead to a spontaneous bleeding. It's often caused by certain drugs and by cancer chemotherapy. Thrombophlebitis is an inflammation on the inside of a vein with the formation of a blood clot at that site. The thrombus might break away. We're really worried about that. Remember, Thrombophlebitis. Phleb is is vein. Itis is inflammation. And a thrombus is just a mass of blood, a blood clot at a site. So we have this inflammation inside the vein, and then blood begins to clot at the site as a way to try and deal with that inflammation. The problem is these thrombi could, bits of it may break off and then lodge in somewhere, causing ischemia. In the lungs, we can have things like pulmonary embolisms. Pulmonary embolism is a block of a pulmonary artery by a particle. It can be, or it can be a mass of anything, even air. But usually but it is often a clot that goes in and causes a blockage in pulmonary alveoli, and it can, lodging in the lung vessel, it can actually cause chest pain and lots of other things, fevers as the body tries to get rid of it. It can result in, it can actually get much worse as well. If it's large enough, then we can't get enough oxygen, and it can be fatal. The treatments have to focus on maintaining your cardiopulmonary function and perfusion with anticoagulants, treatments, special stockings that support the legs, or even stockings, socks that actually, using air pressure, will pump the legs to move blood through. There are lots and lots of cardiovascular drugs, maybe more than any other area of therapy. We have drugs to reduce angina. We've got the nitrates. Um, um, we have drugs to reduce blood pressure. And this is just a partial list. There are 11 different classes of drugs that are used to control blood pressure, because there are many different causes of blood pressure because of the way homeostasis is maintained through multiple redundant pathways. There are a number of drugs that can be used to treat arrhythmias. We can use a series of drugs that will help with class 1 arrhythmias. We've got, we can look at interfering with the way potassium moves out of cells. Remember, I told you that potassium was the major intercellular ion, and sodium the major extracellular ion. If potassium starts dropping in the heart, it can lead to and around especially in the nervous centers that control it, we can have low potassium. Drugs for heart failure include digoxin, diuretics, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, and the beta adrenergic receptor blockers. Drugs, we have a number of different classes of drugs to reduce the lipid levels in our plasma. These include things that act by literally a physical mechanism of absorbing the excess material. We can use fibric acid. Niacin is often used, and the class of drugs known as statins. There are some others as well. Anticoagulants. We have one of the major problems with blood is coagulation disorders. There are people who anyone who has an implanted device is going to be taking a drug to keep to keep their blood from coagulating. It has to be very carefully controlled. There are a series of these things. The most common that we see are warfarin and the low molecular weight heparins, such as Lovenox. Okay, so there we go. We're done with that one. We'll get back to the screen as soon as my computer stops chunking away. And we'll go over here to the course modules. So I recorded this. So when you read it, when you listen to it, send me an email. And the code word will be Manila, Manilla. Let me know that you've done that. Please watch it as soon as possible so that we can have a useful discussion on Wednesday. Go ahead and take a look at the discussion and start thinking about that, as well as the assignment, which is going to be based on these chapters. So start looking at those question pages and just work on that. So, and I would put off the assessment until the end of the week. So I will end this now, and I will look forward to seeing you on Wednesday in class.